Hi, everyone. It's great to have you with us at Attention. I'm Marissa Coslov, Vice President at Insider Intelligence, and I'm joined by Ethan Chernofsky, Senior Vice President of Marketing at Placer.ai. We're going to have a deep dive discussion on how to lean into brick-and-mortar's advertising revival. Ethan, so nice to have you here.
Marissa, it's so great to be here. Thank you for having me. To get started, for those of you who are kind of unfamiliar with Placer.ai, to give you a little bit of background as to what informs our perspective. We're a location data company. That means very simply is people vote with their feet. We're showing you how they vote across the United States every single day. We do that by observing a panel of over 30 million devices very critically. It's all de-identified aggregate data, so we are GDPR and CCPA compliant. We then analyze that data with machine learning and AI algorithms to make estimations on visit trends across the country and show a whole range of insights like visit counts, void analysis, cannibalization risk, cross-shopping, and a whole lot more. If anyone is interested, we have a free version of our premium product available at Placer.ai. And Marissa, I think we can dive in.
Yeah, let's dive right into it. So we are talking now today about the physical location and omni takeovers. You know, a large part of our conversation today is going to be about the opportunity ahead with brick and mortar. And when you think about the growing value of brick and mortar locations as part of the advertising mix, what's driving the change, Ethan? Tell us a little bit more about that.
So I think the context here is really critical because this isn't something that, nobody had ever thought of or nobody ever wanted to do. It's just a bunch of things happened at once to make it possible. And let's kind of think about them. So the first is data availability. So the rise and ubiquity of mobile devices, the ability to leverage AI and machine learning enabled a perspective that just didn't exist in the past. And that creates different types of analytics that weren't available before, but now are, and allow us to do things that we've classically been able to do in the online environment, in the offline environment. The other kind of element has been kind of the necessity of it. So we have data availability, and now we have the necessity of the need to shift offline. And that necessity is being driven by rising costs online, challenges with some of the social platforms, changes to the way advertising is done there, and the need to go to offline in this kind of post-retail apocalypse debunking narrative. So everything was shifting online. We realized that online costs are growing. We actually realized that the physical environment offers something that we couldn't get, plus the data. So now we're kind of refocusing. But then there's other elements. There's this kind of fundamental recognition of what is taking place offline that wasn't before. And the idea of the deeper understanding of how these different channels perform together and what are the different values that they bring. And then finally, there's an opportunity here, and the opportunity is a new channel. So if we think back to like the early 2000s, when so many companies were really making their mark in the online environment, so much of the success of companies that we see today happened because they were early movers in new areas. So those who were really leveraging search engine optimization or social ads as they kind of came into being had a distinct advantage in those early stages because there was less competition. And right now, with the onset of these physical retail media networks, there's a similar environment happening where there's so much opportunity and less competition because it's a newer environment and it's not yet as consolidated. And so that's creating this really significant opportunity. And I think it's really important to understand that within this context of why now and what is the potential of this market.
Well, it seems like we now have a whole new crew of early adopters beyond what we saw in the early 2000s, like you said. But it's also important to recognize that it isn't just the wider context that's changed. The consumer has also changed too. We are all shopping very differently now. How does this play into the opportunity?
So I think it's such an important piece because when we look at shopping patterns, I think, again, let's zoom back to where we were a few years ago. And there was this expectation of kind of endless e-commerce growth and this ongoing decline of brick and mortar. And that's been fundamentally debunked. We think the pandemic was this perfect environment to see physical retail completely overthrown, and it wasn't. And that's because there are certain things that happen in physical retail that are better for the consumer than they are online. And by the way, vice versa is equally true. There are experiences in the online environment that are much better. but it's understanding how those two things play into each other. So thinking about online, the convenience, the push notifications, the speed, the fact that it's everywhere with you is such a huge asset that drives those values and the value of ongoing e-commerce innovation. But the same is true offline, touch and feel, trying on, discovery, looking for new things, walking the aisles. How many times have you been in a store? My favorite example of this is Costco. I have never walked into Costco without a list. I have never walked out of Costco without a basket that is 3 times my list. And it's because you're like, maybe I do need, a human-sized jug of mustard. And that experience is part and parcel of physical retail, and it creates something that's really interesting. And what I think we're realizing more and more is it's not either or between online and offline channels, it's both. And so the question then becomes, how do we leverage these things together to create this ideal experience? And, think about a made up example of how these things play in, but you go into a store and we decide to try on a shirt, and the shirt fits really nicely, and we work our way through the sizes and we find that ideal fit. But then when you're going to leave the store and you're deciding, should I buy one? Should I buy two? They offer you 10% off to join the loyalty program. And the loyalty program is sophisticated, so it takes into account the sizing that I just did, right? It utilizes that in-store visit to then guide the online process. And then 3 months later, it says, hey, we know you love that shirt that you bought. Here's other opportunities within that same size. And so now you're leveraging that in-store experience to produce the online experience. And then when the online experience is challenging, so let's say you get something new and it doesn't fit as well, you promote the in-store return because that's cheaper. And then once they're in the store, they have a higher likelihood of upselling. So it's really not about thinking as these channels as distinct entities, but as two pieces of a wider pie of how we reach the customer.
Sure. And also it's anything that can make it easier for the consumer. And then that ultimately will benefit the brands. Well, it's interesting, that you talk about that experience at Costco. You go in with your list, but clearly you leave with much more. That's a huge opportunity. So how should brands approach that opportunity with brick and mortar? What are some key challenges? And also what are some key opportunities that our audience should be thinking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it starts with really trying to put ourselves within that in-store journey and ask, what is it about that experience that's unique? What is it that's really driving it? And, we all experience it. So we do have that first party information. And sometimes, what's interesting is we have a tendency to overvalue certain things like convenience. So as an example, the pandemic's kicking off, online grocery is at its peak. The question is asked, are we ever going to go to the grocery store again? It's so inconvenient. It's so much easier to do that. And yet we went back to the grocery store, and online shopping in grocery was up a little bit, but not where it was at the height of the pandemic. And that understanding that convenience is important, but it is not the main thing we're looking for. It is a part of what we're looking for is so critical. And when we kind of look at that in-store journey, we recognize that it's really opportunistic. It's experience oriented. It's about walking those aisles. And how do I create elements from an advertising and marketing perspective that are going to drive that journey to where I want it to be? And so, everything from the tactics we use to the places we utilize those tactics. So think digital screens, kind of shop-in-shop concepts, kiosks in other stores where you can promote a different kind of concept. Hey, here's try out this new product that I'm pushing. The idea of leveraging different types of assets to push messages across. So like sanitation stands and the messaging that gives you as people are walking up, and thinking about what fits within that environment and what fits within the experience you're creating. And then how do we break those things down? So the process has changed, right? So it's not just about regions anymore. It can be about behavior. It can be much more refined. We can think about things like, hey, which regions are more influenced by influencers? And then therefore we want certain types of messaging and marketing there. Which regions have different types of psychographic or social demographic data indicating that they're going to have a certain proclivity for or a certain affinity for different types of products. And we don't have to do that just by, hey, we think the LA DMA. We can do that by location. And all of a sudden you can break down an entire country, not by regions, but by behaviors, by cross-shopping, by other patterns that give you a far better indication of the likelihood of a specific audience to purchase specific products. And that breakthrough doesn't just change the way we choose where to put our products. It changes the way we choose where to advertise and how we align all those activities to ultimately increase our bottom line.
Those are some great opportunities. Are there any other key challenges that you can identify with the process?
So I think the key challenge of the process is, how do you embrace the data fully? So, we think about things like, first party data and the values that brings. Third party data is a different animal, and it really forces companies to ask, what do you do with this and how do you best leverage it? So the challenge of understanding how it fits within existing models. How do we apply this in a scalable way? Because as anyone knows, it's one thing to have a really hyper-focused local perspective. It's very different to scale that. So the ability to bring data into processes that can scale, that's the big challenge. And those who can uncover or identify the ways to do that within their own business are the ones that are going to be very well positioned.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. So Ethan, we know the physical world, that we've been talking about is clearly enormous. Where specifically do you expect the impact to come?
So I think there's a few places that are really interesting. And one of them is a little less obvious, and one of them is maybe a little bit more obvious to this audience. So the less obvious one for me is malls. And I think it's less obvious because, again, think 2019. It's retail apocalypse. The country's over-malled. The mall is dying. There's no more value there anymore. And yet, what we've seen is something very, very different. If we look at visit rates to top indoor malls throughout the country, we actually see that numbers are slightly down, sometimes slightly up compared to where they were pre-pandemic, not just when things were really negatively impacted. And the value there is because the malls have been evolving and changing. And they're focusing more on experience, and they're focusing more on having this holistic, full day out ability to something that you can provide that keeps you there from not just shopping and then going home, but shopping, dinner, an experience, more shopping, a coffee at the end, and then going on. And that 360-degree experience is unbelievably valuable. And it speaks to the opportunity from an advertising perspective, because people are spending more time. They're in more mindsets than just the specific shopping, which means the ability to bring them different types of messages is there. They're also there throughout a longer period of time. So if we think malls classically, it's Saturday and Sunday and sometimes evenings. But if a mall is changing its tenant mix to focus more on health tenants, more on fitness tenants, people are coming throughout more of the week, in which case the types of messages that I want to get to someone on a Monday are different than the way I want to interact with them on a Saturday or Sunday. And that change is really significant. And it opens up so many opportunities. And we're seeing malls really lean into this. Much more digital signage, much more focus on kind of these pop-up kiosks that give you an experience as you're walking through. And that's an exciting opportunity. The one that I think is a little bit more obvious, but potentially the most exciting, is the in-store experience. Because I do think it's just the end cap idea is great. And the promotions there are important. But like we discussed before, digital signage, the idea of kind of these little pop-ups within a retail location, shop-in-shops have kind of opened up a new way of thinking about what is happening in retail. And I think the opportunities there are endless to create these really valuable experiences that are close to the point of purchase when we're still in discovery mode, when we have high intent. And that's why where we're going to see so much innovation, those are the areas where I think you're going to see a lot of very strong initial investment when we think about physical retail media.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting. And I think almost that store-in-store concept is almost like a surprise and delight for the consumer, to be surprised that they see another brand in store and find a lot of value in seeing those two together. A follow-up question for you on the previous slide about malls. How do you see data like what you just described being used alongside first-party data?
It's such an important question, because I think first-party data was this really important wave that took place, and that's what drove loyalty programs, and it's unbelievably important. The challenge with first-party data is that it's limited, and it's limited in terms of what you can understand from it, because it's there's nothing to compare it to because all the different data sets are different. And so everyone's first party data has a different kind of set of rules, and that creates challenges. The value of first party alongside third party is that third party provides this wider context that allows you to understand data with relevant benchmarks. The first party data brings added value to the third party data because it allows you to create these kind of factors. So, hey, we know that our competitor has a loyalty program of X number of people. We know that we have Y number of people. And this is what third party data is showing. What are the correlations that we can create that allow us to set now industry benchmarks? So first party data is going to be a critical piece of understanding your audience. Third party data is all about context and understanding where it sits and what it means and giving both meaning and new applications to those data sets.
All right, thank you for that. So you just shared a lot of really great strategies around retail, but are there other areas beyond retail where you think this strategy could have a big impact?
I mean, I'm obsessed with the idea of stadiums and events. And I think, obviously being a big sports fan, this is something that kind of always resonates with me. And I think one of the things that was really interesting when we started looking into the opportunities here were the amount of time that people spend at NFL games. We're now distant from the NFL season, but in the height of it, we were looking at when people were coming, and they're coming 3-4 hours before, and they're staying 3-4 hours after a 3-hour game. And there's, in some cases, tens of thousands of people who are coming on a regular Sunday to an area, and they're never even going into the stadium. They're spending their whole game day in the parking lot, tailgating, enjoying just being in that area. And when you think about who those audiences are and how targeted they are in some cases, you recognize what an insane opportunity it is to be able to engage with 70, 80, 90, 100,000 people over this extended period where they're very emotionally involved and they're physically in the place. So the idea, think of brands that are targeting 30 to 45-year-old men who make a certain income because tickets to a lot of these games are very expensive. There is an audience there that you can reach and create an engaging experience that we weren't really thinking of before. And I think it really asks them to understand who are the audiences for these places? How often are they coming? What are the types of experiences and marketing promotions that I want to do within that environment to engage those audiences in these places? How do I break down, if you're doing something with, Madison Square Garden, the difference between those coming for a Knicks game and those coming for a hockey game and those coming for the Big East Championship are so different. And recognizing the value that comes from being able to target specific audiences and bring specific types of messages and experiences to each of them is unbelievably valuable. And I think you're going to see more brands that, not just the traditional beer company, not just the traditional focus on like kind of insurance, or cars, but other brands in the apparel spaces and beyond get into the mix here.
Wow, that's a really good point. I think I'm a huge sports fan, as I know you and I have talked about in the past, and I'm sure those in our audience who are also sports fans can agree with that. The feeling of being somewhere for hours, if not all day. I think about being at a place like the U.S. Open in the fall here in New York City, where sometimes you could be at the tennis match the entire day. So what a great opportunity that is for brands to be in front of the customer when they have hours to connect with them.
And it's not just hours, it's the emotional state. And I think we talked about this a lot of like, hey, when you're in discovery mode within a store, but look, I took my 7-year-old to his first NFL game in late November. The mindset I'm in there, enjoying this experience where there's emotional involvement, creates a relationship with a brand that it's really difficult to create in a different state of mind. There's a memory there, it's lasting, it's imprinted. And you know what? You're willing to spend more because it's this amazing environment that you're part of. We were spending $10 on a bottle of water. Like if someone had an experience to give me, of course, you're going to do it.
Exactly. Great points there. Well, moving on to the next area here with the customer journey, tell us what else can the data contribute to the story and how can it be best leveraged to identify opportunities, but also avoid risks?
Yeah. So, the starting point is always, how do we identify those places where we want to be? So we talked about this. How do I find by location which places are over-indexed for certain audiences, based on psychographics, demographics, social demographics, and more. But there's other ways that this is actually impacting the viewpoints of brands and advertisers in these locations. So as an example, fitness visits are going up, right? We've left our house, we're all at gyms, and fitness visits are surging. What does that mean for laundry? It probably means we need to do our laundry a little bit more, because in your downstairs Peloton, whatever, you're able to get away with a smelly pair of shorts, but you don't want to go to the gym with that. What is the impact of work from home on grocery stores? How does it change my perspective if I'm working in the office 3 days a week instead of 5, and I can now go to the grocery store on Monday or Friday? What is the impact on inflation on off-price and dollar stores? How do we see those changes? What does that mean for our product mix? What does that mean for the messages we want to have in certain types of retail arenas? How do we want to reach them? How do we want to engage them? Taking the opposite viewpoint. Sorry about that. Think about luxury. Luxury is kind of, in theory, not speaking inflation language. And in a lot of luxury spaces and malls that are oriented towards luxury, we've seen visits do incredibly well. How do you want to message in an environment where you know your luxury audience is taking up a bigger proportion of that visit share than they were in the past? Even something as simple as seeing jumps in the home improvement space early on in the pandemic. Does it change the way you advertise the merchandising you have at a Dollar General or a Walmart? Because you have home furnishings offerings. How many websites did you see change dramatically to say, hey, we have lots of lawn furniture? Not many, even though you know there's massive amounts of demand for those products.
Well, even with that type of messaging change that happened at the beginning of the pandemic, how much is the data that we've seen over the past few years subject to change moving forward? I mean, do you believe that the consumer is returning to pre-pandemic patterns? You brought up the laundry, the gym, the grocery shopping. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we've seen really interesting pivots for the consumer that are unlikely ever to settle back to fully where they were before. But changes are going to continue happening for a very long time. And I think what we've seen from a lot of very smart brands, very smart advertisers, and very smart retailers is the need to be thinking much more short term. So how do we adapt quickly to take advantage of opportunities? We were just talking about sports, the classic Oreo when the lights went out in New Orleans for the Super Bowl. That moment, how do you take advantage? With real-time data, you can be saying, consumer sentiment is shifting and it's going towards home improvement. How do we adapt to that? Consumer sentiment is shifting and it's going towards off-price retail. What does that mean for my messaging if I'm Calvin Klein? And I think there are ways to address or adjust your messaging in order to reach specific audiences in real time. And I think that's the important thing, is recognizing that there have been sea changes and those are going to have an ongoing effect, but there are constant changes. And they can be short-term, and those short terms can provide huge opportunity.
All right. Well, Ethan, we're going to round out our session today with your thoughts on the future. How do you see brands, advertisers, and marketers taking advantage of the opportunity with brick and mortar?
So one, I obviously, and a shout out to a lot of the people at kind of on your end who have done a brilliant job of talking about this, but obsessed with the physical retail media networks. I think there is an endless array of opportunity there. We've talked about some of those channels. I think it demands interest from any advertiser, any brand, any product company to think about what this could mean for them, and for the retailers to ask, how do I need to think about my space differently? And even for real estate developers to think about, how do they think about their space differently? I think about kind of the extended retail media network. So think like stadiums, events, the like downtown events. If I'm a civic group who's attracting people with these huge downtown events, how am I taking advantage of that? How am I utilizing it more effectively? How am I being more data driven? I think the idea of aligning merchandising, promotions, testing within that framework is going to be critical. So it's not just, do we do it? It's how do we measure it? The combination of, first and third party data, like you said, I think offers a huge amount of opportunity. But my favorite, the one that really I think is the model for where this is going, not in scale, but in terms of concept, is the idea of owned locations. So this is what you're seeing on your screen right now, is the true trade area of the M&M store over about a 6-month period in Orlando, Florida. Look at the tremendous reach it had from people walking through and having this crazy experience in an M&M store. Forget the amount of product they sell. It's about the experience they give you and the lasting impact it makes on you. Think about Apple stores. Think about any brand that benefits from this type of engagement and interaction. It runs the gamut. It's every food. Godiva. It's walking through that store and getting the extra, the free chocolate on your birthday month. And what that does in terms of luxury and telling you it's exclusive and making you feel excited about it. And thinking, we just passed Valentine's Day. Like, how many of you went out to a fancy chocolate place to go get that product? This is where the opportunity exists. And it exists for Black & Decker, and it exists for Calphalon to do cooking sessions. But I think own locations are the huge piece that's going to be small, but the ripple effect it'll have towards those mini pop-ups within retail, those kiosks in malls, the experiences at stadiums, that's where they're going to take their inspiration.
All right. Well, I am inspired from all that you just mentioned. It seems like there is a ton of opportunity ahead for brands and marketers. So Ethan, thank you again for being with us today for this great content. It was so good to see you.
Thank you, Marissa.
Next up, we have 2 analyst-led panel discussions, one with Paul Verna on CTV and the other with Deborah Aho-Williamson on social. Join Paul or Deborah next by clicking on the tab below the video that says Next Session. Thank you so much for joining us.